So this video is about what practical goal Christians should have in mind whenever we study the Bible. It seems to me the primary goal of all Bible reading and reflection shouldn't be, as we often hear, how does this apply to my life? Instead, the bullseye should be simply God Himself. The epicenter of the gospel, after all, is the idea that we were created by God and fell into sin and have now been restored to God by His power and grace. So our very existence shouldn't be oriented to anything else except toward God, just as a compass needle by its very nature is always oriented toward magnetic north. So when we read and reflect on these books that God has uniquely breathed His life into, we should be focused primarily on what God says and what God does in these ancient stories, and still more importantly, it means we should seek to understand the meaning and the significance of what God says and does. We do this ultimately to catch a glimpse of God in His essence, what Scripture calls the glory of God. Now, if we do this, what effect does it have on us? Well, Paul puts it this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18. We all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. In other words, we are slowly transformed into the likeness of the image we are focused on. Suppose we hold up a mirror on a sunny day and align it so the sun appears to us in the reflection of the mirror. We shouldn't look directly at it, of course. But if we do this, the reflection of the sun's light will transform the appearance of our face into a sun-like brightness. Paul, of course, is alluding to the famous story where Moses' face shone brightly after he met with God on Mount Sinai to receive His word. So for Christians, these glimpses of God's glory should be the driving ambition behind all our hard work of reading and reflecting on the Bible. Exactly how specific instructions in Scripture apply to our lives today is a good and important question. But in this series, we'll keep our focus entirely on trying to understand what God is saying and doing, and why He is saying and doing it in the immediate context. So no matter how many literary tools we pick up and use, we'll be constantly building toward this one primary goal. So what will it mean in practical terms to read a Bible story keeping our focus on God? Well, let's apply this to the first story in Luke's Gospel, which relates the famous story of the announcement to John the Baptist's parents that they're going to have a child. In this particular story, God isn't, so to speak, a main actor on the stage, so we might be less inclined to focus on Him. But if we scroll through the story, we discover that direct references to God are more numerous than we might notice if we were reading the story without this focus. So what picture of God is painted by these references? What we learn is that God gave commands to Israel to worship and serve Him, and that Zechariah's family was part of the professional class of priests serving God in His temple. On the surface, Zechariah and Elizabeth seem to have an ideal Jewish marriage, where they've served God faithfully into their elderly years. But this ideal picture is discolored by one heartbreaking fact. They've not been blessed with children. Why not? Well, it's not because they were hypocrites, faithfully discharging their professional public duties, but privately disloyal to God in their daily lives. It's also not because they were unfaithful to pray to God for a child. In fact, they probably had prayed for many, many years. So the real question isn't about the character of Zechariah and Elizabeth, but of God. Not only did God fail to bless them with a child while they served Him faithfully and dutifully for so long, but He abandoned them to doubt without any direct explanation for why He hadn't provided a child. Is this kind of God really worth trusting? So let's take note of the messenger's exact words when God finally disrupts the long silence. Luke chapter 1 and verse 13. Your prayer has been heard. It turns out that God had been listening. He'd been listening through all those many years of countless prayers and tears, and of sometimes doubting, and of ceaselessly wondering why God wasn't removing their discouragement and shame. God was listening. No wonder God's spokesman burst with joy when he delivered the news. And it's worth noting that Zechariah and Elizabeth had probably ceased making those requests for a child many years before. Yet their requests had no shelf life with God. Zechariah's name, after all, means Yahweh has remembered. And when God finally answered their request, their prayer was granted at a level far higher than they had originally conceived. Their one son would be the immediate forerunner of Messiah, to prepare the entire nation for his arrival, and would have the unique and supreme honor of certifying the messianic credentials of Jesus of Nazareth. So what we learn about God in this story is that he was trustworthy all the way through those long years of silence. There was never any reason whatsoever to doubt him. So even though Luke's first story is about much more than what we've discussed here, hopefully this serves as just one example of how we can catch a glimpse of God's true character and of his glory when we keep our focus on him while reading a biblical story.